If you are passionate about stories full of mystery, unexpected revelations, and truths that challenge what we know, this video is for you. Here you will discover a tale that has remained hidden for centuries, a confession that, if true, could change the way we understand the most important events in history. Today, we will dive into the final moments of Herod Antipas, the man who ruled Galilee and Perea, known for his role in the death of John the Baptist and his encounter with Jesus of Nazareth. Before dying, Herod broke a silence he had kept for decades, revealing knowledge that tormented him until his last breath. What could this powerful tetrarch have confessed in the final days of his life? What terrifying truth weighed on his heart that led him to confront his own past with words he had never dared to speak while alive? This story will not only take you through the darkest passages of Herod's life, but it will also invite you to reflect on the impact of his decisions, the secrets he kept, and the implications his confession has for history and spirituality. I want you to stay with me until the end, because this is no ordinary story. It is not just a review of historical events, but a deep exploration of a man consumed by power, guilt, and fear of the unknown. As we move forward, you will discover details that are rarely mentioned, fragments of his life that reveal a more human and vulnerable side of the ruler many remember only as a symbol of tyranny. Every word, every reflection we share, has the potential to change your perspective on one of the most enigmatic figures in history. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the impactful stories we share, and activate the notification bell to stay up to date with our upcoming posts. The story you are about to hear is a journey to the heart of uncertainty, ambition, and regret. A journey that shows us how even the most powerful men cannot escape the consequences of their actions or the weight of the truth. Join me on this journey through the last days of Herod Antipas, a man trapped between the reality of his earthly power and the unanswered questions about what he faced in his encounter with Jesus. A confession that not only marked the end of his life, but left an indelible mark on those who heard it. Are you ready to discover the terrifying knowledge he revealed before dying? Stay with us until the end and find out. The night was dark and heavy, as if nature itself knew something monumental was about to occur. In a cold, austere stone fortress, Herod Antipas lay on his deathbed. The room was faintly illuminated by the uncertain flicker of a few torches, whose shadows danced erratically across the bare walls. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the rhythmic but faint sound of his breathing, like a clock counting the final moments of a man whose life had been marked by power, intrigue, and boundless ambition. Herod's face, once proud and full of authority, was now furrowed with deep wrinkles. His pale, thin skin seemed to stretch over the prominent bones of his cheeks. The eyes that once blazed with the intensity of a feared ruler were now sunken and dull, reflecting the weight of a life of decisions that had tormented him up until this final moment. His body, weakened by years and illness, shrank beneath the heavy cloak that covered him, as though trying to protect itself from a cold that didn't come from the outside, but from something much deeper, more internal. Herod was not alone in the room, although the presence that accompanied him was intangible. The air seemed charged with memories, echoes of moments he had tried to bury deep within his mind, but that now returned with relentless force. He closed his eyes for a moment, but instead of finding comfort, images from his past projected with cruel clarity. John the Baptist, the prophet whose voice resounded like thunder in the valleys of Galilee, appeared in his mind. With that defiant gaze and the courage Herod never fully understood. The decision to order his execution had been a turning point in his life, a decision he had tried to justify as a political necessity, but one he now recognized as an act of cowardice and weakness. However, it was not the image of John that troubled him most in his final days. There was another face, another man who haunted him in his dreams, and forced him to confront questions he couldn't answer. Jesus of Nazareth. He clearly remembered the moment that man was brought before him, shackled, but with a calmness that bewildered everyone present. Herod had expected to see fear, desperation, or even a hint of pleading, but what he found was something completely different. A gaze that seemed to pierce through him, strip him bare, and reveal everything he had tried to hide, even from himself. In that moment, Herod felt a twinge of discomfort that he tried to mask with a sardonic smile and words meant to show his power. But deep within his soul, something broke. He had never admitted it, not even to himself, but that brief interaction with Jesus had left a mark on him. It was as if, in those few moments, Jesus had planted a seed of doubt in the heart of the Tetrarch, a doubt that had grown silently but steadily, nourished by rumors of miracles, resurrections, and a message that spread like fire in a dry forest. Now, decades later, Herod found himself face to face with the consequences of his decisions. He had spent his whole life building a legacy, consolidating his power, surrounding himself with luxury and flatterers who dared not contradict him. But in this final moment, all of that seemed insignificant. Wealth could not buy him peace. Power could not protect him from the specters of his past, and the flatterers had vanished, leaving only emptiness and silence. A silence that was increasingly unbearable, full of unanswered questions and truths he had tried to ignore. He opened his eyes and looked toward the stone ceiling, trying to find some comfort in his fortress, that symbol of his dominion and authority. But the fortress, instead of reassuring him, felt like a prison, a place where he had locked not only his enemies but also his own fears and regrets. His trembling hands gripped the edge of the bed, as if seeking stability in a world that was crumbling around him. The door to the room was closed, but Herod could imagine what was happening on the other side. The servants whispered, fearful of what the dawn would bring. The soldiers remained impassive, but even they felt the tension in the air, as if they knew something monumental was about to happen. Herod had been a powerful man, feared and respected, but on this night in this room, he was just an old man, facing the end of his life and the judgment of his own conscience. A shiver ran through his body, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was the coldness of death approaching or something else, something he couldn't name but felt with terrifying certainty. His thoughts became chaotic, jumping from one memory to another, trying to find a fragment of peace, some indication that he had done the right thing. But all he found were questions. Had he been a wise leader or a tyrant? Had he acted with justice or fear? Had Jesus truly been who he said he was? And if he was, what did that mean for him, Herod Antipas, the man who had allowed him to be sent to the cross? The light of the torches flickered, casting shadows that seemed to come alive, as if the ghosts of his past were taking shape to confront him directly. He closed his eyes again, but this time, instead of resisting, he allowed the images to come. He wanted to face them, he needed to face them because he knew time was running out. His breathing became heavier, and a whisper escaped his cracked lips. Jesus. It was the first time in decades he had spoken that name aloud, and the words seemed to fill the room, echoing off the stone walls like a sound that could not be ignored. Herod knew. He was on the edge of something, though he couldn't say what. It was as though the universe itself was waiting for him to make a decision, to make a confession he had repressed all his life. A confession that would not only free him, but also change the way the world would remember him. He closed his eyes for the last time that night, allowing the weight of his life to envelop him, knowing that the dawn would bring the need to face the truth, a truth that had pursued him like a shadow and now demanded to come to light. The room seemed to close in tighter around Herod, as if the walls themselves were alive and eager to remind him of the secrets he had tried to bury for so many years. The darkness of the night was dense, oppressive, and the faint flicker of the torches could barely disperse it. The air was thick with a tension that couldn't be explained by the disease eating away at his body. There was something more, something deep and almost tangible that made him feel this night was unlike the others. Herod closed his eyes, but in doing so, the images of the past presented themselves before him with cruel clarity. They were not just any memories, but scenes he had tried to forget, moments that had marked him more than he was willing to admit. First came the figure of John the Baptist, his voice echoing in the hallways of his mind like thunder. He remembered the day he had ordered him to be imprisoned, his speech about justice and righteousness clashing with the disdain of a ruler who didn't want to be questioned. However, there was something in John that had unsettled him from the start, something in his gaze that spoke of a certainty Herod could never fully understand. The memory of John's execution was like a wound that had never healed. He had acted out of pride, out of the fear of losing his authority before others. That dance, the hasty promise, the oath he couldn't break. He had ordered his death knowing it was unjust. But he did it anyway, and since then, he had felt something inside him begin to crumble. John had become a specter who visited him in his dreams, a constant reminder that his power could not protect him from his own conscience. But if John's death tormented him, the memory of Jesus consumed him. Herod had always thought of himself as a practical man, a ruler who made calculated decisions to maintain control. However, when he had Jesus before him, something in his logic had broken. It wasn't just the calmness of that man, nor the silence with which he faced questions and accusations. It was something more, something Herod couldn't define in words, but felt as an overwhelming presence, as if he were before someone who saw beyond what the eyes could capture. In his mind, he relived that moment over and over. He remembered asking questions, hoping Jesus would beg for his life, show some hint of fear or desperation. But Jesus hadn't done any of that. Instead, he had looked at him with an intensity that made Herod feel naked, vulnerable, as if each of his secrets were laid bare before him. That gaze had haunted him ever since, a gaze that seemed to pierce his soul and reach places even he didn't know existed. Herod shook his head, trying to push away the memories, but they only became clearer, more insistent. He remembered the soldiers' words, the rumors that reached his ears after the crucifixion. Some said Jesus had risen, that his tomb was empty, and that his followers had seen him alive. Back then, Herod had dismissed those stories as mere fabrications, desperate attempts to keep alive the message of a dead man. But now, on this night as death approached, he wondered if there was any truth to those rumors. He had tried to justify his actions for years. He told himself that he had done what was necessary, that his duty as a ruler was to maintain order and eliminate any threat to his authority. But those justifications felt hollow now. In the silence of the night, with no courtiers or flatterers feeding his ego, Herod faced the reality of his decisions. He knew he had acted out of fear, not justice. Fear of losing his power, fear of facing the unknown, fear of accepting that Jesus might have been more than he seemed. His breathing grew heavier, and a chill ran through his body. It was as if the weight of those memories was crushing him, leaving him breathless. Deep within his soul, he knew there was something he hadn't wanted to admit, something he had avoided for years. There was a knowledge, a secret he had buried so deep that even he had tried to forget it. But tonight, that secret was coming to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. Herod clenched his fists, trying to contain the trembling that ran through his hands. He could not ignore it any longer. There was something in Jesus, something that had left its mark on him from the moment he saw him. He wasn't just a man. That idea, that thought he had tried to suppress for so long, now presented itself with a terrifying clarity. Jesus was not like the others. There was an authority in him, a presence Herod could not explain, but one that made him feel small, insignificant, even powerless. Guilt and remorse mixed with fear and uncertainty. Herod knew he was on the edge of something, though he didn't know what. It was as if the past were claiming his attention, demanding that he face the truth he had tried to avoid. But facing that truth meant admitting that he had made a mistake he could not undo, a mistake that had changed the course of history. His mind wandered between memories and questions, searching for a crack of peace, but all he found was more confusion. Who was Jesus really? What did his message, his death, and the rumors of his resurrection mean? Was there something beyond what Herod could understand? These questions plagued him, suffocated him, and he knew he could no longer ignore them. But confronting them meant opening the doors to an abyss that terrified him, an abyss that held the truth about his life, his decisions, and his place in the world. The sound of his breathing grew louder in the silent room, as if it were a constant reminder of the little time left to him. Herod knew he could not escape these questions, nor the memories that tormented him. This night, more than ever, he felt that the truth was near, patiently waiting for him to have the courage to face it. And although fear consumed him, there was a part of him that knew he could not die without confronting what he had tried to avoid for so long. The confession was there, within reach of his lips, waiting to be freed. But would he have the strength to do it? That was the only question that remained. Herod Antipas breathed with difficulty, each inhalation seeming to drain more energy from his already weakened body. The room remained in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the torches and the faint sound of wind seeping through the cracks of the fortress. Though he was alone, he felt a presence in the darkness, something that surrounded him and forced him to face what he had tried to ignore for so many years. He knew this night was not like the others. He knew something had to come to light, something he had kept hidden, buried deep in his consciousness. For a moment, Herod closed his eyes, trying to buy time, but the images of the past returned with relentless force. He saw everything as clearly as if it were happening in that very instant. He remembered the trial of Jesus. The first time he had him before him, chained, escorted by Roman soldiers. He had been brought to his presence with the hope that Herod would issue a definitive verdict. The religious leaders had presented him as a blasphemer, a troublemaker, who threatened the stability of the region. And Herod, aware of the political implications of the situation, had tried to approach the matter with caution. But deep down, he knew this was no ordinary trial. Jesus was not like the other men who had stood before him. There was something in his presence that disturbed Herod deeply. It wasn't just his silence or the way he refused to respond to the accusations. It was his gaze. Herod could recall that gaze with a clarity that bewildered him. There was no fear in those eyes, nor hatred or resentment. There was something else, something Herod had never seen in anyone, a mix of compassion and certainty, as if Jesus knew something that others could not comprehend. That gaze had disarmed him, though he never admitted it. At that moment, Herod tried to maintain composure, asking Jesus about his supposed kingdom, hoping to provoke him, or at least extract a response that would help him justify what he was about to do. But Jesus remained silent. That silence was heavier than any word. It was as if Jesus were saying that nothing Herod did would change the course of events. It was as if everything had already been decided. And that terrified Herod. Herod's voice trembled as he began to speak aloud, as if he needed to release those words from his mind. I asked him if he was the king of the Jews. I demanded that he answer me, but he only looked at me. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me. And in that moment, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt I was standing before someone who saw beyond me, beyond this world. It was as if he knew everything, not just about me, but about what was going to happen. Herod stopped, taking a breath. His hands trembled as he gripped the sheets that covered his frail body. He closed his eyes again, but the words of Jesus echoed in his mind like an endless echo. Finally, he spoke. Herod continued, his voice cracking. He told me something I will never forget. It wasn't words of defiance or pleading. He just said, "You have said so." That was his answer when I asked if he was the king of the Jews. He didn't try to explain. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply said those words and fell silent again. The memory of that moment had tormented him ever since. Herod had always been a man used to control, to being the one who made the final decisions. But in that encounter, he had felt small, insignificant, as if his power meant nothing before that man. He clenched his lips, trying to suppress the tears that threatened to escape. After that, he continued, I felt unsettled. I couldn't understand it. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind of fear I had felt before. It was something deeper, as if I were seeing something I couldn't fully comprehend. Herod paused, letting the silence fill the room. He didn't know how much time had passed since he started speaking, but he felt the words flowing from him like a river that had been dammed for too long. He forced himself to continue, knowing he couldn't stop now. When they sent him back to Pilate, I thought it was over. I thought that man would be just another rebel, someone whose name would be forgotten once his body hung on the cross. But it wasn't like that. It didn't end there. Something changed after his death. Something I can't explain. Herod's face contorted as he recalled the rumors that began to circulate shortly after the crucifixion. They spoke of Jesus' empty tomb, of some claiming to have seen him alive, of his message continuing to spread even beyond his death. Herod had tried to ignore these rumors, dismissing them as superstitions, but there was something in them that disturbed him deeply. I heard my men talk about the empty tomb, he admitted, his voice barely audible. At first I didn't pay it any mind. I thought his followers had stolen the body to perpetuate his message. But something inside me, something told me there was more, that not everything could be explained so easily. Herod leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and desperation. One night, he whispered, I decided to go see the tomb for myself. I went secretly, without anyone knowing. I wanted to make sure everything was in order, that there was nothing more than the rumors and stories of others. But when I got there, something was wrong. The tomb was empty, yes, but that wasn't all. There was something else, something I never told anyone. Herod's breathing grew more erratic as the words he had kept for so long began to pour out. I saw something in the tomb, he said, his voice trembling. There was a light that didn't come from any torch or from the reflection of the moon. It was a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And in that light, I felt something. I can't explain it. It was as if that light was showing me something, as if it was telling me that everything I had believed up until that moment was wrong. Herod squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to push that image from his mind, but he knew it was impossible. I felt there was something beyond this life, he continued. Something I couldn't understand, but it was real. And in that moment, I understood. I understood that Jesus was not just a man. He was not just a prophet. He was something more, something I had never known before. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Herod dropped his head back against the headrest of the bed, exhausted by the confession. He had kept those words inside for decades, fearing what they would mean if he spoke them aloud. But now, at the end of his life, he could no longer keep them in. He knew what he had seen, what he had felt, was real, and he knew his life would never be the same again, even though he had little time left in this world. Finally, he whispered, as if speaking to himself, I have carried this weight for far too long. I thought I could ignore it, bury it. But you cannot bury the truth. You cannot escape it. Jesus was more than we were willing to admit. And now I know. I've always known. Herod remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stone ceiling. His lips trembled, as though the words about to come out carried a weight his body could no longer bear. The air in the room felt denser, as if even the shadows dancing with the flicker of the torches were waiting for what he was about to say. He shut his eyes tightly, trying to summon the courage to say what he had kept for so many years, the torment that had haunted him in every dream, in every moment of solitude. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak, but filled with an intensity that filled the room. "It wasn't just the empty tomb I saw that night," he said, with the words slowly coming out as if each one cost him a piece of his soul. "There was something else, something that has haunted me since then, something I could never fully understand, and now I feel the truth is consuming me." He paused, letting the sound of his labored breathing fill the void. His trembling hand searched for the edge of the bed, as if he needed to hold on to something tangible to keep from being lost in the memories that assailed him. "When I entered the tomb," he continued, "I expected to find only silence, an empty stone, and a missing body. But what I found was different. There was a scroll, something that shouldn't have been there. At first I thought it was a trick, something his followers had left to confuse us. But when I held it in my hands, I knew it wasn't ordinary." Herod tilted his head, as though he could still feel the scroll between his fingers. "It wasn't written in a language I knew," he said in a trembling voice. "The letters were strange, ancient, and they seemed to glow faintly under the light. But when I looked at it, I didn't need to understand the language. The words seemed to inscribe themselves directly into my mind, as if I wasn't reading, but hearing a voice coming from somewhere beyond this world." Tears began to run down his face, and Herod made no attempt to stop them. He had reached the point where he could no longer repress anything. "The message was clear, though terrifying," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It said that what we had done that night would not only seal his fate, but ours as well. It spoke of a change we couldn't stop, something that would transform everything we knew. It said that the world would witness a kingdom that would have no end, a kingdom not built by human hands, but by a force we could not control." Herod paused, his face contorting with the anguish of reliving those moments. "But there was more," he said, his voice breaking. "The scroll spoke of the darkness that would consume those who denied it. It said that those who did not recognize the truth would carry a shadow that would follow them to the end of time. It said that denial would not save us, that even in death we could not escape what we had done." The silence in the room was almost unbearable, but Herod continued, driven by the need to release what he had held inside for so long. "I felt a cold that was not of this world, a weight on my chest as if the very air refused to enter. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back, that what we had done was not just a political act but a spiritual mistake, something that would condemn us beyond this life." Herod raised his gaze to the ceiling, as if seeking some sign of redemption in the gray stones. "The scroll didn't just speak of Jesus," he said, his voice filled with fear. "It spoke of a conflict that is not of this world, a war between light and darkness that has existed since the beginning of time. It said that what we had witnessed in him was not just the death of a man, but the beginning of something our minds could not comprehend." The memories seemed to swirl in his mind, growing more intense. Herod clenched his fists, as if trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions flooding him. "That day," he continued, "I thought that by getting rid of him, it would all end, that his message would vanish with his death. But it didn't. His message grew stronger. And now I know why. He was not just any man. He was more. He was the embodiment of something that transcends everything we know, and we rejected him. We condemned him." Herod's face twisted in a mix of despair and regret. "Since then, every night I hear his voice," he said, the words coming out like a lament. "It's not a voice of condemnation, but of truth. It asks me why, It asks me if I understood what was before me. And now I know I didn't understand, but I always knew. I knew there was something in him that couldn't be explained, something that couldn't be contained by our laws or our power. Herod took a deep breath, as if trying to release the weight that had oppressed him for decades. That scroll, he finally said, wasn't for others. It was for me, for us. It was a warning. It told us that we couldn't stop what he represented, that his truth would move forward, with or without us. But the most terrifying part was what it said about those of us who denied it. It said that those who rejected the light would be consumed by the darkness, that there would be no peace for us, in this life or the next. The silence returned to the room as Herod let his head fall back, exhausted by the confession. His eyes filled with tears once more as he whispered, "I could never escape that truth. I've carried it all these years and it has destroyed me, but I can't keep it inside any longer. Jesus was not just a man. He was the light we refused to accept. And now all that is left for me is to face the darkness I chose for myself." Herod closed his eyes, allowing the tears to flow freely down his face. He had said everything he could say, and although the weight of his words still crushed him, he also felt a strange sense of relief. He knew there was no redemption for him, that what he had done would haunt him beyond death. But at least, in that moment, he had faced the truth, a truth he had always known could not be silenced. The room remained silent, as if even the shadows were processing what they had just heard. Herod took a deep breath one last time, feeling that the end was near. And as the cold of death enveloped him, only one image remained in his mind: the gaze of Jesus, filled with a light that neither time nor darkness had been able to extinguish. Herod remained motionless, his weakened body barely supported by the bed where he lay. His words had filled the room with an indescribable weight, as if each confession released from his soul hung suspended in the air. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded with meaning, with a truth that could not be ignored or denied. His eyes, clouded by the years and suffering, stared at the ceiling, as if searching those cold stones for a reflection of something he still couldn't reach. The confession had exhausted him, but it had also freed a part of him that had been chained for decades. It was as if, with each word spoken, with each memory brought to light, something of the weight that had crushed him began to dissipate. But that relief didn't mean peace. Not yet. There was an internal battle still being fought within him, a struggle between the remorse for what he had done and the faint but present hope that perhaps not everything was lost. Herod knew he had reached the end of his path. There was nothing more to be done except to face what came next. His trembling hands, the same ones that had signed death orders and directed acts of power, could barely hold on now. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, as if trying to empty himself of everything that had tormented him for so long. The image of Jesus returned to his mind, but this time not as a memory that haunted him, but as a presence that seemed to fill the room. It was the same gaze he had felt during that trial, the one that had disarmed him without the need for words. But now he didn't perceive it with the same fear. There was something different, something he couldn't explain, but that was beginning to make its way inside him. Perhaps it was the certainty that, although he had failed at the crucial moment, he still had a chance, no matter how small, to redeem himself. In a barely audible whisper, Herod spoke again, as if his words were meant for someone beyond that room. "I cannot change what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "I cannot undo the harm I caused, nor bring back the lives of those I condemned. But if there is something I can do before my time is up, I will do it. Not for me, but because I know the truth cannot remain hidden." That word, truth, resonated in his mind like an endless echo. He had spent his life manipulating, distorting, and hiding the truth to maintain his power. But now he understood that this power was nothing but an illusion, a facade crumbling before the reality of what Jesus had represented. And if there was anything he had learned from that confession, it was that truth, though painful, always finds its way. With effort, Herod tried to sit up in his bed. His body protested with every movement, but the determination he felt inside urged him on. He didn't know how much time he had left, but he knew he had to make the most of it. Beside him, on a small table, there was a blank scroll and a pen. He had ordered them to be there, as if deep down he had always known this moment would come. His trembling fingers reached for the pen, and with a deep breath he began to write. Each stroke on the scroll was slow and laborious, but Herod didn't stop. The words flowed from his mind with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wrote about what he had seen and felt in the empty tomb, about the message of the scroll he found, and the truths he hadn't wanted to accept. He wrote about his encounter with Jesus, about the gaze that disarmed him, and the words that had haunted him since. But above all, he wrote about the change he had begun to experience inside himself. A change that, though late, he felt was genuine. As he wrote, he remembered the teachings he had heard from those who followed Jesus. He had despised their words at the time, dismissing them as the delusions of fanatics. But now those words resonated in his mind with an unexpected force. Love, forgiveness, redemption. Concepts he had always considered weaknesses now presented themselves as the only truth that could sustain him in his final moments. Time seemed to stop as Herod wrote. He didn't know how much time had passed, but when he finally put the pen down, the scroll was filled with his words, his story, his truth. He looked at it with a mixture of exhaustion and relief, as if this simple act had been the culmination of everything he had repressed for years. He knew that this scroll wouldn't change the past, but he also knew it contained something that needed to be known, something that could have a purpose greater than himself. Herod let his head fall back against the headrest of the bed, feeling how his body finally surrendered to the fatigue. But this time, there was no fear. For the first time in decades, he felt a calm he couldn't explain, as if the act of facing the truth and sharing it had alleviated the weight on his soul. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness of his mind, he saw Jesus gaze once more. But this time, it wasn't a gaze that stripped him bare. It was one that accepted him, that understood him. His lips moved one last time, barely a whisper that was lost in the room. "Forgive me," he said, not knowing if those words would reach anywhere or if they would be enough. But what he did know was that, in that moment, he had done everything in his power to face the darkness that had consumed him. And though he didn't know what came next, he no longer feared facing it. The light from the torches began to fade, leaving the room in a tranquil dimness. The scroll remained on the table, its words written with effort but filled with a sincerity Herod had never known before. It was a testimony, not only of his guilt, but also of his hope, of the possibility that even at the end, truth might bring with it a form of redemption. When Herod's body finally fell silent, the room seemed to exhale with him. The scroll remained there, a reminder that, although men fall, the truth endures. And as the night gave way to dawn, the first light of the day illuminated those words, as if the world itself were ready to receive what Herod had left behind. A truth that, though late, had finally been set free. A truth that, in its essence, was more powerful than any kingdom Herod had ever ruled. The dawn arrived slowly, painting the horizon with soft hues of light that seemed to contradict the darkness that had reigned in the fortress during the night. The body of Herod Antipas lay motionless on his bed, his face finally relaxed, as if in his last moments he had found a peace that had eluded him throughout his life. The room was in complete silence, but the scroll he had left on the table seemed to vibrate with the weight of the words it contained, a testimony that would change more than the memory of a man. The message Herod had written was not only a confession of his deeds nor an attempt to atone for his guilt. It was a narrative that contained fragments of a greater truth, a truth that went beyond his own failures and decisions. He had written about the scroll he found in the tomb of Jesus, about the fear that consumed him when reading those words, and about the certainty that the figure he had condemned was not merely a man. He had written about Jesus' gaze, about the feeling that the trial had been the most decisive moment of his life, even though he hadn't known it then. The servants of the fortress entered later that morning, their steps hesitant and their faces tense. The news of Herod's death spread quickly through the halls, and although his passing was not unexpected, it left a void that few dared to comment on. He was a man whose legacy was marked by power, ambition, and controversial decisions, but also by a mystery that was now beginning to unravel. The scroll was found by one of the servants, who at first did not understand the importance of what he had in his hands. He took it to the priest, in charge of the spiritual matters of the court, and it was he who read the words written by Herod. As he advanced in the text, his face changed. First came disbelief, then astonishment, and finally a kind of fearful reverence. What Herod had left written was not just a personal confession, but a narrative that connected to something much larger than him, something that could not be ignored. The priest summoned the local religious leaders, who gathered in private to discuss the content of the scroll. Herod's words spoke of the empty tomb, of the message in the scroll he had found there, and of his conviction that Jesus was more than a prophet or a rebel. They spoke of a light that could not be extinguished, and of a kingdom that would not be built by human hands. They also spoke of a warning, a shadow that would follow those who had denied the truth. The meeting grew tense. Some of the leaders argued that the scroll should be destroyed, that the words of a dying man should have no weight against the established structures of religious power. But others, impressed by the sincerity and detail of the narrative, insisted it should be preserved, that what Herod had written was a testimony of something that could not be ignored. After hours of debate, they decided that the scroll would be kept secret, away from the eyes of the public, but not destroyed. However, as with all truths that are attempted to be hidden, Herod's account began to leak. The servants who had been present could not remain silent, and gradually rumors began to spread. There was talk of a message left by the Tetrarch, a man who had witnessed something extraordinary and who, in his final moments, had confessed a truth that could not be taken to the grave. The rumors reached the followers of Jesus, who were already struggling to spread the message of his resurrection amidst opposition and skepticism. For them, Herod's testimony represented an unexpected confirmation, a recognition from one of their most ardent opponents. Although they could not access the scroll directly, the fragments of the confession that leaked became a powerful tool to reinforce their message. They not only spoke of Jesus' resurrection, but also of the transformation of a man who, in the end, could not deny what he had seen. The legacy of Herod's confession was not immediate nor easy to accept. For generations, his account remained in the shadows, circulating as a near-mythical story among those who sought proof of Jesus' divinity. However, over time, the figure of Herod ceased to be seen only as a tyrant and began to be remembered as a man who, though late, had the courage to face the truth. His story became a reminder that even the most powerful, even those who have committed the greatest mistakes, can find a path to redemption if they are willing to accept the truth. The scroll itself remained hidden for centuries, protected by those who understood its importance. Though it was never made public officially, its existence continued to be a source of speculation and debate among scholars and believers. For some, it was tangible proof of Jesus' resurrection. For others, it was simply a personal confession from a man tormented by his conscience. But for all, it was a reminder that the truth, no matter how terrifying, always finds its way. Ultimately, the true legacy of Herod's confession was not in the words he left written, but in the very act of confessing. In his final moments, he faced the weight of his decisions and chose truth over silence. He chose redemption over condemnation, not because he expected to save himself, but because he understood that there was something greater than himself, something that deserved to be recognized. Herod's story became both a warning and an inspiration, a proof that even in the twilight of life, repentance and truth can open doors that once seemed closed forever. And while the world continued to change, while Jesus' message kept expanding, Herod's words remained like a distant echo, reminding everyone that light always triumphs over darkness, and that truth, though painful, is the only path to true freedom. The account of Herod Antipas, a man whose life was marked by power, ambition, and doubt, leaves us with a profound lesson. For years, his position as tetrarch allowed him to make decisions that defined the life and death of many, but it also trapped him in a web of fears, guilt, and secrets. In his final moments, when he had nothing left to lose, he chose to face what he had ignored all his life, the truth about Jesus and the impact he had on his heart. Herod, like many powerful men of his time, sought to control the narrative surrounding his reign. He tried to suppress the truth, manipulate facts according to his own interests, and secure his legacy through fear and force. However, what he faced in his final days was not the threat of his enemies nor the challenge of his contemporaries. It was something much deeper and more devastating: the confrontation with himself, with his conscience, with the deeds he had committed, and with the truths he had rejected. Herod's confession, written on the scroll he left behind, was not only an act of personal redemption, but also an opportunity for the world to understand what he himself came to recognize too late. His words, filled with regret and fear, but also with an unexpected revelation, remind us that even those who seem furthest from the truth can, at some point, see it clearly. Herod's message is uncomfortable, even unsettling. It speaks of a terrifying knowledge he could not ignore, of an encounter with a presence that disarmed him, of a certainty that haunted him to his deathbed. But it also speaks of something that transcends fear, the possibility that there is always a moment to recognize what is true, to release the weight of guilt, to choose the path of redemption. This story invites us to reflect on our own lives. How many times have we ignored important truths because confronting them would make us question everything we believe? How many times have we chosen silence out of fear of the consequences of speaking? Herod shows us that, though it is painful and terrifying, it is never too late to seek the truth and acknowledge its transformative power. The end of his life was not marked by the titles he held or the political decisions he made. His true legacy lies in the act of facing the truth, even if it came at the end of his journey. That moment of honesty, of vulnerability, of confronting what he had tried to avoid, was what allowed him to find some peace in his final moments. And what about us? Are we willing to face our own truths before it's too late? Can we learn from Herod and accept that the truth, though uncomfortable, has the power to free us? These are questions we should all ask ourselves, not at the end of our lives, but while we still have the opportunity to act. Herod's story is not just a historical or religious tale. It is an invitation to reflect on our own decisions, on the fears that hold us back, and on the opportunities we have to seek something deeper and more meaningful. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth can open a path toward something better. If this story has made you reflect, intrigued you, or you feel it has an important message to share, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us keep bringing stories like this that not only entertain but also invite thought and connect us to something deeper. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming posts. Here, we continue exploring impactful stories, hidden truths, and moments that teach us life lessons. We want you to be part of this community that values knowledge, reflection, and truth. Finally, we'd love to know what you think about this story. What do you think of Herod's confession? Do you believe his final act can be considered redemption? Or do you think it came too late to change his legacy? Leave us your comment and share your thoughts. We love reading what our followers think and creating spaces for dialogue. Herod's story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, there is an opportunity to choose the truth. Are you ready to face yours? We leave you with this question, hoping the answer inspires you to look beyond what you know and find what truly matters. See you in the next video.